suffered tremendous loss during the Depression, and by 1930, work was stalled on the ship which was to be Britain's pride. Many were reduced to the breadline. And so, her husband did something as king rather unprecedented by previous generations of British royalty. He stepped in. He'd used all the sway they held with politicians, unions, and bankers to get as many back to work as possible. After much lobbying and a merger between the two giants, Cunard and White Star, as well as a massive loan, the shipbuilders were back at work, along with carpenters, tile and marble setters, fabric makers, mural artists, and other craftsmen. The number employed in the construction, design, and outfitting of such a grand ocean liner totaled in the thousands, all of whom were ecstatic with their King George and Queen Mary, who'd rescued them from destitution. Edward had taken part too. At least in this he'd done his duty. In so many other ways, he shirked his responsibilities, and she and George were deeply disappointed in their eldest son. David, as his family called him, preferred to flit about, attending lavish balls and garden parties, carrying on with women, and in general exhibiting behavior unbecoming to a prince. It had gotten so that he and his father were barely speaking. And it hurt her. After they'd lost little Johnny, her other children had become even that much more precious to her. Although maternal love was another emotion she did not find easy to communicate. All she knew was that she didn't want more distance, didn't want this estrangement, not after all they'd endured together. Now, David had taken up with that woman, that divorcee, an American, no less. Imagine it. Imagine him thinking he could choose such a person. Didn't he understand who he was and what was required of him? Why, she herself had been engaged to George's brother, Albert. Yet only 6 weeks later, Albert died of influenza. She'd been devastated, of course. Nevertheless, Albert's mother, Queen Victoria, had chosen her, Mary. It was Mary's responsibility, when the time came, to be queen consort, and it mattered not which of Victoria's sons ascended to the throne. A year after Albert's death, his younger brother proposed, and Mary accepted. There was no question that she would. George was to be king, and Mary's allegiance was to the crown, first and foremost. Fortunately, she and George were well suited. She glanced over at her husband with fondness as he smiled and waved to the multitude. He was such a good king. At the outbreak of the Great War, George carried out 5 visits to the national troops in Flanders, endeavoring to boost morale. During one of these, he was thrown from his horse. His pelvis was fractured, and he never fully recovered his health. The smoking didn't help. Occasionally, when they were alone in their private quarters, she might sneak a cigarette or two herself, but in the close confines of the car, her nose wrinkled at the strong odor of tobacco. His habit was incessant, and it was killing him. They both knew it. The thought of where that would lead was only one more thing that made her sad. It pained her to consider that David might not be a good replacement. He was being stubborn, intentionally so, in thumbing his nose at convention. He flaunted Mrs. Simpson, escorting her everywhere, buying her a vulgar amount of clothing and jewels. He was even pressuring them to allow her to attend their silver jubilee. She would never permit that. Never. The very idea made her exhale a long, restless breath. At the sound, the king turned his head in surprise. "Something amiss, May?" May was the nickname only those closest to her used, and when George said it, it was always said with warmth. His affection for her was genuine, and that assuaged her. At least with him, she could believe she'd done things right. There was no censure coming from him, the kind of condemnation she felt coming from David every time he looked at her. "Not at all," she hastened to reassure. "I was just—" Her words were cut off by one of George's coughing fits. He reached for his handkerchief, his body jerking forcefully, and she leaned away to give him room. She didn't dare touch him, not even to pat his back. He hated being coddled. Hence, though it troubled her to do so, she pretended to ignore his ill health, just as he did. All of it was worrisome. Her husband's ailments, her son's defiance, and what might happen to the empire as a result. There were times, she could admit only to herself, when she grew impatient with it all, when she wished she could just go off somewhere on